The Game Boy Advance was a handheld console that came out in the early 2000s, which means its hardware was severely limited compared to the home consoles of its time. But that didn't stop game developers and designers from turning those limitations into opportunities to present their games in the most creatively beautiful ways, with visuals that haven't aged a day. This video is about some of those games. Beauty is subjective. Let's just put that out there to clarify beforehand that this is only my opinion about which Game Boy Advance games are the prettiest looking ones. Also, these games were picked purely for their visuals, not gameplay, so keep that in mind if you see a game here that you think wasn't very fun to play. Good gameplay is obviously the most important thing in a game for me too, but as someone who's always been interested in art and does it for a living, I've always had a very keen eye when it came to the visuals of the games that I played. And finally, this list isn't in any particular order. It's not a countdown, they're all listed at random. With those disclaimers out of the way, let's begin with the first game, TMNT. Like most Ninja Turtle games, this was also a side-scroller beat-em-up that let you play as any of the 4 turtle siblings as they take on a variety of thugs of different skill levels and palette swaps. It was based on the 2007 animated film that was really poorly received and came out the same year, but while the source material was a creative failure, this game turned out to be a lot of fun to play as far as beat-em-ups go, despite not selling too well. But what really stands out in this game is the graphics, of course. It was one of the last few games to come out on the GBA, at a time when game developers had practically mastered how to get the best out of the system, and it really shows. The heavy use of blacks are what make these visuals so good looking. They're a callback to the original comic style, and they add a layer of grittiness to the game that the other Ninja Turtle games don't have. The generous use of black shadows also make the other colors stand out by contrast, which in themselves are very muted compared to a lot of GBA games. They're easily visible on the non-backlit AGB001 model, but they look just as good on the backlit AGS101 model, which is a rare achievement on a console library where many games look very garish on the newer model to compensate for the subpar visibility on the older model. The character movements are buttery smooth, and there's a lot of visual detail that's crammed into the character designs, yet somehow never looks messy. The same goes for the backgrounds too. The use of light and shadow is phenomenal and adds a nice gritty atmosphere that's very reminiscent of the original comic book. This game is a short one that you can finish in about 6 to 7 hours or so, but it's definitely worth playing. Up next we have Dozer. Like TMNT, this game was also released in 2007. It was developed by a little company called Game Freak, which at the time was known for their breakout hit Mendel Palace, the magical Taruruto game, and a couple of small random releases that grew a tiny cult following. Dozer is already considered to be a GBA classic with amazing gameplay, but not enough people talk about how charming the character designs and environment designs in this game are. The cutesy visual style is also unique. The color palette is a little reminiscent of the Wario games, but executed with so much more precision and consistency. And I suppose that's the best way to describe this beautiful game. Visually consistent. Each inanimate object or character looks like it would fit perfectly in its own game environment and nowhere else. That doesn't sound like a compliment, but it is. It's a testament to how thoughtfully the visual language has been crafted. Like TMNT, this one also looks like it's one of those modern games that are inspired by the retro pixelated aesthetic but still have the visual flair and complexity of a modern game. If you didn't know any better, you wouldn't guess that this game was made way back in 2007 for the Game Boy Advance. It's such a masterpiece. Our next game doesn't have such a good reputation despite coming from a downright legendary franchise because its gameplay falls a little on the generic side. But Popeye Rush for Spinach was a huge reason I even decided to make this video in the first place. The moment I started it up, I was so blown away by how picturesque the backgrounds were. The colors pop out but never look oversaturated. The character animations are just as detailed and just as fluid as the classic 1940s cartoons that they're based on. It's a side-scrolling runner game where you race the other characters to the end of the level, which is admittedly a weird kind of setting for Popeye to be in. He would have been better suited in a beat-em-up or a side-scrolling fighter, but the gameplay itself isn't as important as the beautiful visuals. The art style in the backgrounds perfectly recaptures the whimsical yet meticulously rendered backgrounds of the original cartoons. And despite the generic smartphone tier gameplay, I would actually recommend you play this game purely to admire how well the artist behind this pulled off such a feast for the eyes. Like I said, the gameplay is nowhere nearly as engaging as the previous 2 games, but it's still engaging enough to keep you playing. And honestly, even the weaker points in the gameplay become easier to ignore the more you soak in the visuals. And speaking of legendary franchises that haven't done too well in the video game front, I present to you Astrix and Obelix XXL. Look at it. Look at the thing. If I told you this was a PS1 game, you would have believed me. While I've always been impressed by GBA games that have some semblance of 3D in them, I was never really a big fan of most attempts at 3D in this console. It wasn't designed for 3D heavy games, and most developers only attempted them as glorified experiments. Sure, they pushed the hardware to its absolute limit, but what's the point if said limits often end up looking like this? So I hope you realize how much of a big deal it is for me to have included this game in this list. It's not as pretty as the previous 3 games, but holy crap, I'll be damned if this isn't the most stunning 3D Game Boy Advance game ever made. The fact that they were able to make the character movement so smooth and the gameplay as functional is just icing on the cake. My only gripe with the appearance is that at certain locations the environment can warp in some unpleasant ways and end up looking wonky. But that still isn't enough for me to keep this absolute beauty off this list. This truly is comparable to a lot of PS1 games, arguably better than a good number of them. It still looks surreal to see this playing on a Game Boy. You know what's even more surreal though? Sword of Mana. Unlike the other games in this list, this one actually came out in 2003, quite early in the GBA's life cycle. And that makes its already beautiful visuals that much more impressive. Not only is it easily one of the prettiest top-down RPGs in the Game Boy, but everything else about it is just as well executed. The music magnificently sets the tone of the story and the combat is fast-paced and intuitive. But let's focus a little more on the visuals since that is the point of this video. This game's text boxes have a design that's ornamental yet blends in with the rest of the game screen. Now this game obviously looks gorgeous, but what really makes it stand out from other games is the little touches that add more life into the world. You can see the tiny blades of grass swaying in the wind, the water has little ripples in them, the world always seems like it's teeming with life. Each house interior has a very unique looking setup. Sure, they've reused assets after a certain point, but they took the trouble to make their layouts distinct from one another, which is a nice touch for a game console and for a genre in which most houses would have the exact same 2 layouts with the exact same assets. I'm looking at you. The environments look so organic in this game and don't let themselves get restricted by the square grid on which they were designed. Look at how the houses aren't all facing the same direction and don't look like they're made by a modern city planner, which is even more impressive when you remember that they're made with the same limitations that produce visuals like these. The lighting effects in this game make everything so much more atmospheric. Just look at the way the torch shines over there. The shading on each element and character has been masterfully done. Look at the bluest tint under the bridge here. Waterfalls have a beautiful looking shimmer. There's a generous use of color overlays to give another layer of atmosphere in the environments where they're used. And these are just the visuals I've been gushing about all this time. The game as a whole is such an underrated masterpiece and I highly recommend you play it. Which is obviously something I've been saying about all the games in this list. But the next one is a game I would probably recommend more than any other game I've talked about so far, not only because of how well-rounded and timeless it is, but because of the special place it occupies in my own history with the Game Boy Advance. It's Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. I first played this in school when I borrowed it from a friend, and what stood out to me even before the cleverly written dialogue and dopamine-inducing gameplay and music was a stunningly crafted visual design. When I first played this game, I didn't think it was possible for GBA games to look this good. I felt like I was playing an actual cartoon. The game barely looks like it was made for a 32-bit system. If I didn't know any better, you could have told me this game came out a couple of years ago and I would have believed you. Timeless visuals are a defining trait of all the games on this list, but even more so for this game in particular. So much so that even after they remade this game for the 3DS, there are a lot of people that still feel the GBA title had more personality than the new one, and I obviously agree as well. The thick lines for the characters make them pop out way more than the 3DS remake. Everything is so much more clearly defined. This was the first game I ever saw on this console that had such expressive characters. I was blown away by how much love and care was put into these animations. This is one of the games that inspired me to start collecting old GBA games in the first place, despite living in a country where 99% of them are fake and it's really hard to find originals. To this date, Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga is still my favorite Mario game and I've played a whole lot of them. And with that we come to the end of this list. Going over these games and why I like them made me realize that despite so many people, myself included, describe the Game Boy Advance as a very graphically limited console, that wasn't really the case. The console could do stunning visuals fine. It was up to the developers and designers to creatively bring that out from their games. Sure, the console struggled with 3D, but some people made it work really well. And if the recent resurgence of pixelated or modern animated games is anything to go by, it's clear that 3D is not necessarily the benchmark of good visual design. Whether it's gamers or game companies, more and more people are realizing that good visuals can be represented in many ways that don't involve polygons. If there was ever a time to revisit these old Game Boy Advance games that honestly haven't aged a day, it's now.